I would like to extend a very warm welcome. And what we decided to do this evening is that we will start with Sebastian by reading an extract from the work, because we thought it was important that a great number of you are very, very familiar with Sebastian's writing. But when you hear the text, you can think as Sebastian Barry is reading his extract, trying to imagine how you might render that in some of the languages that you speak here in this room. So even as a mental exercise, as you listen to Sebastian speaking, it's worth reflecting on that. And then we move to one or two questions about the work. And then we'll, with our translators, we'll look at some of the challenges and the pleasures of translating Sebastian's work. So, Sebastian,
yes. The person whose existence this book tries to examine is Tom Kettler. And he's a retired Garda who's been 9 months holed up beside an old Victorian castellated house in Dalkey. And he's visited by two men from his old division, whom he's delighted to see, but at the same time, it undoes him. And the book really is about the petals of his mind exfoliating. And the effort he makes to put them back where they belonged in the first place. And that's really the book. In the course of the book, he has cause to talk about the person who was most beloved to him in his days, which is June, his wife. And he's just talking here briefly about being down in Dunleary with his colleague Billy Drury and going into the Wimpy on the main street in Dunleary. If anyone over 60 here might remember the Wimpy in Dunleary and the magic of it. And that's where he meets June. And then he just talks about the first time they went on a date. As you'll see, it's a sort of an Irish date, which involves in those days doing absolutely nothing of any monetary consequence. That seems to be how the things were in those days. Just to bring us to the place where my beloved translators have to go as well, I will torture you with a few lines of Paddy Kavanagh's If Ever You Go to Dublin Town, because I always felt that was the little song that belonged to this book. I'm going to translate myself now into the book. If ever you go to Dublin Town in 100 years or so, ask for me in Baggot Street and what I would like to know. He was a queer one. He was a queer one. And around 11 a.m., having traipsed about from house to house, up and down Patrick Street, the curious snake of York Road, which started among the working class houses and their damp little yards and ended among resplendent mansions, hanging gardens, he and Billy would drag their sorry arses into the Wimpy Cafe and get that weak coffee in the opaque glass cups, white as seashells, and stick their sore legs under the formica tables, and Billy liked to play the jukebox. And that's how they got talking, himself and June, mocking his dubious taste in country and western. Nothing wrong with Johnny Cash, in her blue outfit and the white bib thing like a nurse's nearly. He would laugh, and Billy, being an easygoing head enough, yes, he was a lovely lad, really would laugh and call them bollocks under his breath, because he didn't want to give scandal to the fool kids that do the plastic benches. Joe Dolan and the drift. And Billy would go on writing his notes and endless notes. He was the best, most meticulous writer of case reports in Harcourt Street. And then there was the famous day
is forevermore in his heart, anyhow, when he and June went walking down into Monkstown on a sort of date, and went out far onto the pier there, where the summer grasses were left to grow like a long narrow meadow, and the sun was so hot on the wooden seats that the blue paint glistened. And they sat together, smelling the salted air that was stocked so thick with fishy smells, because too hard to trust the oily water was the stubby beer for the trawlers, the heroic fishermen of Dunleary, with their Wellington boots as creased as the skin of elephant, and the boxes of otherworldly ones. They sat together, picking at the paint blisters with their fingers, June's bare legs covered in an almost imperceptible suggestion of downy hair, or something of a strange meadow, and her skin as brown as almonds, and her tongue dress, and her trim form, and the crazily perfect face, as it seemed to him. Someone so lovely he could barely breathe to think she was with him. Him, a mere copper of dubious extraction in his 30th year. The touch of her hand, not obviously like fire, but burning him all the same, burning his hand.
Wow. Well, after reading like that, anything is going to seem a bit superfluous and an anticlimax. I won't be able to inject my questions with the same drama. But I suppose I wanted to begin, Sebastian, with a question about Tom Kettle. So he's a Garda. I think the Steward of Christendom. The central is a former RIC officer. DNP. Oh, DNP. Yeah. But it's were you attracted by, a kind of a figure of authority? Was this kind of ambiguous position? On the one hand, he was somebody that was kind of custodian of the law, but by virtue of who he was also somebody that saw the unspeakable law breaking that was going on in the society all the time. But this kind of funny, ambiguous position that he was in, was it something attracted you to that character?
Well, I'm in this book. It's in the third person, so I am the creature at his shoulder, trying to see and hear what he is seeing and hearing, and taking it down faithfully as best I can, without analyzing it, without diagnosing him, for instance, and how his mind is or is not. I think I was quite a way into the book before I realized, oh, well, now another book or play about a policeman. It just didn't somehow, wasn't the first thought I had about it. But the important thing for me about Tom Kettle is obviously his degree of trauma. He's been in a home in Ireland. He's been abused in that home. Not that he talks too much about his own travails on that score. He's gone, as many boys did at the age of 16, across the sea into the British Army, and he's fought in Malaya in that one of those dreadful end of empire wars. I mean, truly horrific. Similarly in Aden and those places. He's come back from there, and the only reason he can get a job in the police is because he has acquired the skill of a long-distance marksman. There was no way a man like him, who'd been in a home, who had been an orphan, could ever have been allowed to join the Irish police. Amazingly, I tell you this fact, because he would have been considered persona non grata, the lowest of the low, literally the scum of society. But he has this skill, and that carries him forward into this next phase of his life. He's my age. I was 66 when I wrote this book, and he is 66. He has lived through all that mysterious history that we lived through. the mysterious, muddy history our boots were deep in. And what was valuable to me in him being a policeman is, therefore, he has a forensic mind. And it seems to me one of the most important things in talking about Irish history or recent Irish history, but more particularly about the abuse of priests of children, is the forensic mind. The sort of mind who would be, if he were writing a report about something, he would do it in particular vivid detail because that's his duty as a person. There's something in Tom, having been a victim himself, he's also profoundly a witness, in particular to his wife's travails, which she tells him about rather appropriately on the coast of France when they're away on their honeymoon, far from the land, you might say, where she can speak. This is the whole, the benefit of that to me was that I could trust him not to do that thing that often happens in accounts of terrible happenings. They start to be given comfortable phrases. Even the phrase child abuse is almost a comfortable phrase next and nigh the actuality of what happens to a little Babalach with a large person coming to bring their sexuality to them. I knew that he would be able to look all that in the face, as he had to himself and in the case of his wife, and be able to describe it. And that is the sort of mercy he lent to me, because the thing that has bedeviled me most as an Irish citizen, as a person, as a writer, as a human being, it has been this whole history we've had in this country. And I felt he would be, if nothing else, even in his great own travail in the book, a faithful and assiduous and recorder of these things.
Because one of the things that he does say, he describes when he is a Garda and when people ran away from the homes, how they were returned to these homes. Yeah. So although he himself is a spectacular victim of this violence that was done to him, he also feels a kind of complicity.
Of course, because he was obliged to do that as a policeman. I mean, I have some dear friends, and some of whom I was at Trinity here with in the 70s, who are in the judiciary. But I have to say that looking back on that period of time, and to a certain degree, in the later period of trying to recompense people who had suffered in this way, the sad fact is that in this period of new Irish history, of a new Ireland, of a new country, and of course, one that was so disappointing to so many who had fought in the various wars to attain it and who left the country, nevertheless, in this embittering landscape, remind me quickly of this.
Oh, was it the complicity, about,
yes.
Yeah.
Well, he's had to do that as a policeman, which is a ferocious fact. And the fact is, if you were a little person and you were sent away to one of these places because of the supposed great sinfulness of your mother, for instance, even a living person, then who was going to help you? Certainly, for people who are abused, the people who are minding you and caring for you were not going to help you, they were going to hurt you. So what would you do? Any of us here would say, well, I'm getting over this wall as soon as I can, and I'm running as far as I can away from here. You might be 8 or 9 having that thought, and over you go and you run. Who brings you back? Your Irish police force, supposedly the people protecting you as a citizen, brings you back, does not believe you, brings you back. Who has sent you there in the first place? Under no law that I'm aware of, nothing in the statute books that I'm aware of, the Irish judiciary routinely sent children to these institutions. So the ferocious fact of it is that our own institutions of care, our own which should have been new magical institutions that we were going to reinvent ourselves. We were going to maybe find again the Bretton laws I don't know what we thought we were going to do, but we did these things instead. And for an Irish person, a person like me who genuinely, because I do know it rather well, loves their country, it behoves us to think about these things and try and learn from them. And even now, when I hear of the treatment, even the other day on my way to Bastia in Corsica, I was given a lift by a taxi driver called Madge, and she had been in an institution in Dunleary, and she even remembered the name of the woman in charge, Mrs. Eccles, who had offered up the babies to the pharmaceutical companies of the day. This would have been in the 50s and 60s, to be experimented on. And it just, I thought, you know, I'm total non-believer and agnostic, but I did think the gods had given me Madge to remind me why I've tried to work so hard with this book and gone everywhere with it and bashed my brains out over it, because it seems to me important to us as a people to be highly aware of these things, and also not with the cliches, not with the comfortable phrases, but to talk about it in proper terms as the rape of somebody very small, as a rape of us when we were small, and not to sugarcoat it or call it something else.
Sebastian, that brings me to the question of language. I'll ask you a question about this before we move to our translators. And so one of the things is to try and address and talk about these very, very dark and difficult things that remained unspoken, that words weren't there to the people who suffered from them. Is there well, you know, when you're reading the book, and one is aware that, you know, the language that you're using, the ambassador talked about, you know, different kinds of English and so on, and so you as a writer here in Ireland are writing a particular kind of English. But you know, Joyce talks about this, you know, fretting the shadow of another man's language. I noticed the word "wushdan" ends up at one point in the novel. So, do you think that one of the challenges when you're writing a book is using the particular kind of English that, you know, is spoken here in Ireland, which was often used to euphemize things and cover things up, and to actually use it in a different way to make it reveal things,
but also as an instrument of survival. John Montague wrote so well about the tally stick. If you spoke a word of Irish at school in the 1840s, you'd be beaten. But the other side of it was people wanted their children to learn English so they would no longer be dying of famines. It was a language ostensibly of rescue, as well as other darker aspects. And I was a little boy. I mean, there's this little boy in the book who lives with his mother is more or less mutatis mutandis, I mean, changed by fiction myself. And I was a little boy who couldn't read or write till I was maybe 8. And part of the reason for that was I understood language as being, especially when we came back to Ireland from London, as being that entity or physical flight of birds that came out of the mouths of the people that I loved most, like Annie Dunn, who has her own book, who was my great aunt. And I understood language as being a floating physical thing. And I was quite surprised and puzzled by the fact that my father had this traveling bookcase built for him by his father, who was an artist, full of all these penguin books. And I didn't know what was in them, what could be in them. My sister, of course, annoyingly could read from the age of probably 3. How dare she? So language was a physical object, and I still feel it like that. And when I'm working, I don't speak out loud, I don't do anything like that, but there's a part of the brain that leaves all that still, that cannot read nor write, and is only a sort of taking down the music of the thing you're hearing. It can be a dark and battered music, but also music. And that's how I understand. Now we can call it the English language, but as Plato will tell us, things have their best existence before you name them. I mean, English, I've just named it, is the thing that's been spoken of probably for 1,000 years in Dublin in various forms. I was born between the canals, which probably doesn't mean anything anymore. I thought it was a physical thing that I didn't have a name for, but I also am shockingly without my own language. I mean, didn't Yeats say that his native language was Irish, but his mother tongue was English? Well, Yeats, as far as I know, had almost no Irish, so I don't know where that puts his saying. And the silence around Irish in my mouth is almost absolute. But you mentioned, Chris, silence. Not Chris, sorry. You mentioned Irish silence, and we were told when we were 6 or 7, when we became aware of certain things happening around us, never to say anything. That's the thing. The injunction was do not speak. So it didn't matter it was Irish, English, but we were to maintain our silence. And actually it occurs to me now, having asked that beautiful question, that we maintained our silence in English. Even our silence wasn't Irish.
Talking of speaking and language and silence and making things inarticulate and articulate, Laetitia, I want to go to you. And so you've translated a number of Sebastian's works, and in your experience to date, what have been the most challenging aspects of the work? Is it trying to find some French equivalent for the specificity of Sebastian's language, or?
Good evening. First, I would like to say that literary translators, we're not used to speak in public. We work alone, sometimes in pajamas, on written language. So thank you for being here, for being kind, and pardon my French. About the challenging language of Sebastian, I would say that maybe Days Without End was the most challenging, because Thomas, the narrator, Thomas McNulty, is illiterate, so his English is not correct, but still it's poetic. And so in French, I had to create a new language to convey that language. And I had to use some tricks, some French tricks that I won't tell about them here. No, some of them I cut off all the negative things, for example, or put words together, things like that. Like people, when they don't speak good French, talk, they don't write, but they talk like that. That's what I try to do. But so I use some tricks, but we are all tricksters in fact, even you, Sebastian, because you had to create a new language in that book too, because you're not a man from the 19th century and you never immigrated from America like Thomas. So, and to give you an example, to give you an example of how tricky it was, the first sentence of the book, which is the method of laying out chords in Missouri to the probable cake, and I can assure you it wasn't a piece of cake to translate. It's the perfect example of how you can spend the same amount of time translating one sentence as on translating the whole book. And to convey that idea of the probable cake, I choose to use an old French phrase, which in fact means the idea it was quite a thing to see. And the second reason, which was so difficult, Days Without End, was the problem of violence, the killing of the Indians. But I love this reason because it allowed me to translate Sebastian's work, because his previous translator, she said it was too hard for her. So indeed it was hard, but after the first reading, I said, wow, I'm going to do that. And then, while translating it, I understood that those descriptions, of awful description of the killing of the Indians, they became literature. And I think it is the strength of the lesson to be able to do that. And in fact, the novel, the subject of the novel are not the killings, but they are the love between those two men, Thomas and Sebastian. Oh, no, sorry. sorry.
Can I say just something
absolutely.
briefly about that? Are we at the right distance from our microphone? You are perfect.
I know.
A bit back from that, but because you're talking so brilliantly, I want to hear what you're saying. The first sentence of the book actually took probably 9 months to write that, and for a long time, it was the method of laying out a corpse in Missouri sure took the proverbial biscuit, because that's what we say in Ireland. And eventually, after many, many months of feeling there was something wrong with this sentence, I was looking around in some book about American English, and I found, to my joy, that in America in the 1860s, they more generally would say cake. And as soon as I said cake, the sentence was done, because I'm always looking for that first sentence. And I'm relieved to hear it took you a while to fashion it. And then the rest of the book is lying in behind the sentence. You have to tilt the sentence and you see the rest of the book there. So much so that my beloved friend Sasha Sykes, who is a great artist and furniture maker, made me a bench for our whole, with something I said at an event at the time. The whole book was lying in behind that one sentence, and she carved it on this bench. So that's where we sit when we're putting our boots on to go and walk the dog, to remind me of that miraculous fact. So yeah, you really remind me. That was so brilliant what you said. Thank you.
Aga, in terms of the translator as trickster, trying to cope with particular challenges, working between English and Polish as non-cognate languages, and then the particular kind of English that's used by Sebastian. What was the most challenging aspect of this for you?
You know what? I was thinking about it a lot, because just to translate different kinds of English is it is a challenge enough when you work with the language that is Polish, because in Polish we do have regional varieties of the language, but as a language that is spoken pretty much only in one country in the world, it's often a struggle to come up with regional varieties of English. Let me say it that way. So, whether it's Scottish or it's Irish or it's Northern Irish or it's Welsh and so on and so on, each of these languages have its particularities, which the translator has to be aware of. And it was something that often made me think, how do I deal with it? Because as a translator, you have this very, very particular duty to the author you work with, but also to the people who speak the language in a book and the people who speak their language, right? So if I'm translating someone who speaks an Irish English, Hiberno English, I have to keep in mind that I am not allowed to make it sound strange. Sorry, I'm not allowed to make it sound strange. Because if I have to, in order to make it stand out as a different type of English from, say, RP, I have to make it sound different in Polish, which is a very homogeneous language. But if I make it sound weird or strange or funny, it will suggest that people who speak Irish English or Welsh English or Caribbean English speak weird and funny, which is abominable. And it's something that, no translator should ever do, right? Because it's exoticizing and orientalizing of language. And it's also, especially with the languages that have this trace, more than a trace of colonial violence to them very often. It is our duty to keep that in mind, that the way that people speak English in various parts of the world, Ireland included, has this history of violence behind it. And the way we speak English needs to carry that within it. So it cannot be funny and it cannot be weird. It cannot sound strange, but at the same time, it has to sound different. So how do you do that? And that's the main challenge that you have to keep in mind whenever you're, translating regional varieties of English, which is pretty much every variety you've got. So this utmost respect that you have to be conscious of all the time when you're working on it, but also creative freedom that lets you render the differences between, different shades of the same language that is the same language and is not the same language at the same time. And it's also double interesting for me as a person who comes from a very, very particular region in Poland, because I come from the Pomeranian region, the Western Pomeranian region, which until very recently was not Polish at all. So I come from the part of Poland that was relocated after the World War II. And it is also a kind of a silent history that is ingrained in the language that I speak, because unlike every other part of my country, the Western Pomeranian region has no dialect on its own. We speak very clear Polish, a very transparent Polish, because we have no past. And we have been indoctrinated in a way to speak the clearest Polish there is in order to accommodate the people who live there and to make them Polish. So we have been, in a way, robbed of our past. My ancestors come from today's Belarus, which used to be Poland, but then they were relocated to today's Poland. And many people who live there have this kind of past that has been taken away from them in a way. So we struggle with our identity a lot because of that, and because of this lacking that we have in our language. And it helped me a lot when I work on books like yours, Sebastian, because it always makes me think about the language that I work with and how something that is missing can sometimes be the most powerful part of what's there.
Yes, Chris, can I bring you in here as someone who is very familiar with the languages of Ireland, been working with Irish authors for several decades now, and Aga was talking there about that particular difficulty of not wanting to exoticize a language, but at the same time wanting to capture things about it. And I think you probably have translated more of Sebastian's books than most people. So what would you say about that? I mean, what's your own sort of, because we've had various fascinating readings of how as a translator you deal with that question of difference, but without trying to exoticize.
Well, I can basically only repeat what these two have said before me. I think we have to make a distinction between books, between a novel such as Days Without End, which I think represents, in Sebastian Barry's case, a certain radical departure from his previous and possibly from his subsequent narrative style. And the other novels, which, if you like, pose those problems that you just defined. So I think, like you were saying, Days Without End was a terrible challenge, not just the first sentence, but all of the sentences in the novel. And I basically was near despair before my esteemed editor, Claudia, said, Chris, free yourself from Sebastian Barry. Find a sound. And I mean, you heard just before what sound and rhythm and musicality can do, either in the room or on the page. So find something that tells the reader that this is an English, i.e. a German, that is different from all other Englishes or Germans, if you can say that, in the past, and find your own, musicality. I don't know whether I succeeded, but shall we say the reviewers were all very, very much in favor of those solutions. But that is, if you like, a special case, whereas what you were describing actually, applies to most of the literature hailing from Ireland, in that it does use, most of the time, either the Irish language in the first place, or if it is the English language, a particular variety of English. And as you were describing, we cannot do much. It's an eternal dilemma. I remember, I translated 7 of Sebastian Barry novels, and the only other Irish author that, if you like, is almost the same in terms of numbers is Patrick McCabe. And I remember a young student in Düsseldorf had to write a review as part of the examination, a review of one of the German, of a translation of one of the novels by Patrick McCabe, which says, are we in County Monaghan or are we in Bavaria? Because Patrick McCabe in that novel used a very colorful language, and I tried to somehow reproduce it. And the problem is, if you have High German only, what we call Hochdeutsch, it is weak, it is pale, you have to have some regional influx, if you like, but that, of course, runs the danger, as you say, that you locate a novel that should be in County Monaghan suddenly in some definable area of Germany, and normally you can't do it. But that was the price, that I had to pay for creating color, because the original was colorful. But anyway, it's a bit, you all remember the Bible and the story of the creation. And it says, and God called the light day and the darkness night. I think that's the English translation. And of course he did, didn't he? But at the same time, he called it Tag und Nacht, and he called it jour et nuit, etc., etc. So that is the dilemma, I think, that all of us are facing when we translate. We have to recreate or transcreate something in a language that is not the language of the original. Now, God apparently spoke Hebrew when he named all those things. Now, your English is my Hebrew, so to speak, and it's a dilemma, I think, that we cannot satisfactorily solve, except maybe that we might give the reader in the Tag language some pleasure in rediscovering a world that is not their own, be it a dark world. But then again, we have to talk something about something else, not just the darkness, because there is lightness in that novel, a bit like day and night, light and darkness in creation. There's also some lightness in that novel, I think. Yeah, that would appeal to me very much.
Yeah, well, precisely on that point of light, the question of humor, because there's a lot of extraordinarily dark material in this book, but there's also extraordinary kind of humor in it as well. And because I have you here, I would love you to read a particular passage which is kind of close to my heart, having lived through the Irish summer. And what it did to us. And I suddenly found there was a kind of an aria to Irish weather on page 192 of the novel. So, Sebastian, if you
don't
mind.
It comes from chapter 13, where his neighbour, Ronnie McGillicuddy, who is a cellist, but who also has a gun, a long-distance rifle set up on his balcony, all the more easily to shoot the poor cormorants over on the Muglins to the left of Dalkey Island, which is something that was actually happening in the 60s when I was a little boy there. There was a person, and he certainly wasn't Ronnie McGillicuddy, and he certainly wasn't a cellist, but he is playing he will play the Colin Dre for Tom Kettle, but before that, Tom is trying to work his way, as a person who's been very isolated, work his way into a more easygoing friendliness with this man. And so that's basically what's sort of happening in this couple of paragraphs. And before I read it, I just want to say, in case I don't get a chance afterwards, to say that for this little boy who couldn't read or write, if I had known that 60 years later, these magical people would be trying to represent me, as it were, or my news, my good or bad news, in another language, in a language I will never really be able to speak, and certainly not write in myself, it feels like an enormous boon. And I feel just plain lucky and happy to be sitting here at this table with them. And anyway, this is what he says here, or what I say, noticing is in his mind, I suppose, as the writer. And he's trying to understand this strange person called Roddy McGillicuddy. Of course, he's Irish, but Tom thinks he might be English, and he doesn't like to say that, in case it be offensive, to call him to be English by mistake. When they had spoken before, Tom had noted the English accent and the nice sardonic way the man had of talking, even about the weather, as if the Irish weather were his adversary, which it was in its way, the Irish weather, which would so rarely play ball with the plans of citizens. All public holidays were guaranteed to be rain-swept, stem to stern. It was the given of Irish life. A trip to the beach, begun in blazing sunshine, would inevitably end in shivering tears, in sudden storms, in lids of cloud. How often the Irish person of whatever age or sex had lain on his or her towel on any beach in Ireland, body stiffening with the assault of the cold, waiting for the cloud cover to pass over and the gladsome sun to pour down again. Soon the shivering passes to convulsion, to an epilepsy of exposure. The victim quails, squints up the sky with one eye, because there is a glare even in the cloud, trying to make a judgment. Should I stay, or should I go? Is there any point in lying here, as gradually death seems a desirable thing?
Yeah, I don't know if you remember. Do you remember translating that passage?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Question I wanted to ask you, and I wanted to ask the other translators as well before we ask the audience here and online for questions, is just about the reception of Sebastian's work, for example, in France. I mean, is he seen as specifically Irish writer or a writer from the English-speaking world? Is there the climate in terms of translated literature a generally positive one?
Yeah, of course, it really seems like an Irish writer for sure, because all the work is about Ireland. And he's really well known. I think things the French scriptures, like maybe in all countries. And he's on the long list of the prime ministers right now, which is one of the three most important prizes in France in the importance. So yes, in the very Irish, well-known, renowned author.
And for you, I talked earlier about the sort of the specific challenges. What are the things that you most enjoyed working on the translation of Sebastian's work? What was the, were there particular passages, particular moments, particular?
I wouldn't say any particular moments, but I would say that the language is so beautiful. And I would say, especially in August time, it's maybe even more beautiful in that one. Maybe because there is kind of stream of consciousness. You are in Tom Kettle's mind, And because this is a novel where you never know if the characters they are real in the novel, or if they are ghosts. And you answered the question about the musician. It does exist, but I have a story to tell you, Sebastian. When I was translating the book, I asked your Joël, your French publisher, editor and publisher, and I said, "What about musicians? Joël, do you think that he's real with the ghost?" And she said, "Well, I don't know, but was that to ask Sebastian? He will tell you he doesn't know." Well.
Aga, I know this is your, I believe it's your first Sebastian Barry novel.
It is my first Barry.
Yeah, and so first experience. What are the things that you find particularly engaging? I mean, Laetitia has mentioned the question of is the language as well for you? That
it was exactly the same language as Laetitia had to work with. So yes, it was gorgeous. But also, you know what? It's old news to mention Roland Barthes, who spoke about the death of the author. And now we live very much in the age of the death of the author. We sometimes say that even in Poland, especially now, because we have this growing popularity of translators. And sometimes people will say, "Oh, this is the amazing book published by A, translated by B, edited by C." And sometimes, like, there was this one time they forgot to include the author of the book. So everyone was so important, they forgot about the author. But you know what? The author is long dead when we speak about literature today. But when I was working on Sebastian's book and when I was translating him, I kind of felt like he wouldn't let me kill him.
Yeah.
Which is a beautiful gift for the translator, because there is a lot of literature in which the language of the author and the sort of way the author works with words kind of allows you to kill him in the process, make it yours, devour him. Like, it's kind of cannibalistic in a way sometimes, because you sort of engage in this process in which you kind of don't know who is whom and who are you really, working on and with. But Sebastian is one of the very few authors that have this absolute control over the way they write. And this kind of author doesn't let you do that. You refuse to be killed in your language. And this is...
When you're 68, I mean, everything you can, stay alive.
And this is... I kind of stuck to this metaphor, but what I mean is that you kind of have to be independent when you work on a translation. You cannot hang yourself, on the author and on their language, on their thoughts. You have to have the courage to step away from that. But at the same time, it's very easy to get carried away with stepping away and to get too far away, or to forget there was an author in the first place, and you sort of work with the text as if it was your own. And it takes really, really a lot of control over the language that your author has, in order not to let you forget for even one moment that they are there and they're not going away. So that was the nicest thing to me, really, because it gives you the special connection to someone's brain,
Well, obviously, being an author is a very, very risky business.
Always was.
The threat either of deification or murder. Chris?
Yes, because years ago, when you're 22 in Paris and you're going to the British Library, ironically, to read all the books, you do notice there was a trend in English fiction at that time to be very impersonal, as sort of auto-da-fe effect of the author, so that everyone more or less sounded like everyone else, and that was admired and proper, because the author was required not to possibly be dead, but to disappear.
To be transparent as much as they could, right?
Yes, and so that personality or fact of being alive in one place at one time was not required of you. But in the same tradition, I was noticing mostly, not my own authors, you know, like Joyce and Yeats, but somebody like Thomas Hardy, who, when you open any page of one of his novels, which of course he didn't rate as highly as his own poetry, let's leave that aside, you know that you're in a Thomas Hardy novel. In fact, you're with Thomas Hardy, and he has not died. He may have died physically, but he remains somehow embedded in the syntax of his books. And what I've always believed, both in plays and in novels, that if you can access as accurately as you can, even though you're making it up, the syntactical nature of your character, then even even in a sort of seance sense, you are bringing them back into the world. And that's what I'm always hoping for, that in a sense that I will disappear and that they will appear instead in my place. So I'm just also noticing, God help me, how much cleverer my three translators are. I mean, I don't know whether to be thrilled or I'm just noticing it.
This is the risk just gets amplified, Sebastian. Chris, I know because I asked you this question a month ago in a different city, different time. What to name of all the writers that you've translated from the Irish kind of literary pantheon, that Sebastian Barry was up there at the top of your list. I mean, what is it in particular that's attractive? Because you as you say, you've translated quite a number of the titles at this stage.
Well, I think the answer was given just then when you talk about the syntactical nature of the character. I find that amazing as a phrase, because you see, when you have accompanied an original author for quite some years, I mean, they could get tired of themselves. I could get tired of them. But the good thing about Sebastian Barry, it seems to me, is that he, if you like, refreshes himself from novel to novel with, I wouldn't say a new syntax, but with this particular angle with which he approaches the characters that he creates. And that is, as you said before, the incredible thing, that you create a character who, however, you think, in a sense, has sort of, what's the word, infiltrated you, you know what I mean? But what I wanted to say in particular, because we said before, Irish authors have a certain way, many of them have a certain way to operate with the English language by incorporating Irish bits and pieces. I mean, I could list some of them, I mean, Gaelic, or by using a particular form of Hiberno English. But then, of course, you have the personal style of the author, and something was said about the language. And when I look at it, I mean, you are, I think, a lover of metaphor, which can be difficult when, especially in a different language, the metaphors sort of, what's the word, get out of hand, you know? But also, for example, assonances, alliterations, which again, in different languages can be problematic. But it's lovely to hear, for example, you just read the passage, gladsome sun, right? Even if an old-fashioned word like gladsome, you know, to find the equivalent in the new language. Or you talk about the shames and shambles of childhood. Now, the pleasure would be if I were able to recreate the meaning and the sound and the rhythm all at the same time, which sometimes works, and then you're happy as a translator. And sometimes it doesn't work, and then you're sad as a translator, or you have to compensate for it. But the other thing that I wanted to mention, you said the disappearing act of the author. Quite often translators are told they should disappear within the work, so to speak, within the translation. I don't believe in that. I do believe that you and I will also add, so to speak, to the original work in a way that makes our work unmistakably ours. Like if you were to translate into German, another Sebastian Barry would be born, other than my own Sebastian Barry. So I think we are all not disappearing. We are all here, and we are all visible, and we want to be visible. And it's great to be visible.
Right, absolutely. And I'm so grateful we are.
Can I say one?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that is another profound statement from Hans Christian. But there was a lovely moment in my history with Hans Christian, because he does ask me things and he sends me notes, and also he very gently corrects some of my more egregious errors. There was, I think it was either an Annie Dunn or A Long Long Way. Annie Dunn is Annie Dunn, and A Long Long Way is Willie Dunn, her brother. But there's a moment where either Willie or Annie says that if we go up to the top of Lough Maquillan, which is the mountain behind us in Wicklow, that you can see Dublin in the distance. Now, this I simply wrote down as an act of total truth. Chris, find Lough Maquillan. And wherever he stood at the top, he could not see them. He'd be lucky to see the sugar loaf. So he pointed this out to me, and much to my, it stands to me. It stands to me, I think, in the halls of literature that I didn't change it. But what a thing to do, that you're a translator. And look, there's no joke to climb it. Any person has died and they're probably not translating now.
Obviously, greater love hath no translation than he who climbeth the mountain. But I think we've time possibly for one or two questions from the. I've got a question here online, but I'd like to start maybe with the. Does anybody have a question? Just all I ask is you keep it short. Yeah.
So sing it would be
fine.
I was just wondering, to what extent, if any, is it important as a translator to understand the culture of the country that of the author you're translating? In this case, Irish. It's like, do you need to spend time in Ireland, or do you have to have Irish experiences? Is it important to read other Irish authors, and is that a distraction or help? And switch kind of a little bit like and also kind of a lot of spending. Or could you kind of approach it after say, okay, I don't know anything about Ireland, but I'm going to translate this text?
Any question about? Yep. Yeah, go.
For me, question for me. It was productive.
No,
okay. I think that in some measure it's quite important to be able to understand the culture. For example, I would love to learn Italian and translate from Italian. And the first, I don't have time to learn Italian. Second, I realized that I don't know about the Italian culture as well as I know about the English, Irish, American, and so on culture. And that would be a big problem. So I decided to stick to English.
Mm-hmm. You know what? I have two answers. One answer number one is that a couple of years ago, I translated a book about New York. It was very New Yorkish, that book. It was about people who live in New York. And I was given an interview in the radio, and the journalist, who didn't seem to think much of me, asked me whether I've been to New York. And I said, no, I've never been to the US. And he said, oh, I see. And then I said, well, I also translated a book about space. So I don't think that you have to have an experience of a country you translate books from, especially if you translate from English, which spans from Canada through Caribbean to New Zealand. But we are very privileged to live in time in the time and age where you can't be anywhere without being there. Of course, having lived in Northern Ireland in my case, but having visited Ireland as well and other parts of English-speaking world has helped me immensely, because I do have some knowledge that someone who never was interested in that would not have, like some particular ways of speaking or what do you mean by this particular phrase and things like that, or some places or some, I don't know, foodstuffs and things like that. But on the other hand, it's really no longer as necessary as it used to be. So I would like to, on one hand, say that it does help you immensely. It makes your work so much easier, especially being interested in the country you are, because you could spend 20 years in the country and know nothing, next to nothing about it as well, and next to nothing to its culture, to its customs, to its people. So it's up to you whether or not you learn about it. But let's not overrate it as well. We have internet, we have other people we can contact. We can immerse ourselves in many, many cultures, not all of them. But as for English-speaking world, we could easily immerse ourselves in any country we like. If I wanted to specialize in Louisiana from today onwards, I could spend half a year immersing myself in Louisiana without ever, coming across the danger of being eaten by a crop, like it's no longer as important as it used to be, although it's helpful.
Yeah. Chris, do you want to come quickly in on that? And then...
Maybe just one thought to take that one up. I think cultural knowledge is absolutely essential, but it doesn't have to be like physical knowledge in the sense of being physically somewhere. You know that Germany used to be a divided country, like Ireland still is, and the colleagues in East Germany could not, as you know, leave their country, most of them. But quite often their translations of, let's say, an English novel was far superior to those done by their Western colleagues because they had more time, more support, etc. And of course, that was quite often before the age of the internet. So it was harder to do research, but research had to be done. In Germany, in German, we have a lovely word, I think. What is required of the translator? We say Weltwissen, knowledge of the world. And that doesn't mean just Ireland, of the world, Louisiana and everything. And you have to acquire it in some shape or form. And as you said, today it's easier. At the same time, I would say I've been in this country for 43 years now. So that helps. And for example, this particular novel, I'm quite grateful to Sebastian Barry for having said it in my home turf, Dorky, Killiney, everything, including Sweetstown Castle. Exactly. It's so familiar to me. That's great. That's a great help.
He was thinking.
I have set 2 novels in Paris, Tennessee, and I have certainly never been there. And for Chris or any other translator to go there would be disaster.
And mind you, he's a fictional. So this thing about Luna Cool is completely fictional.
For the Irish part, here is my Irish informer. In fact, he asked the question, but when I have a problem, like the big problem, I ask him.
We've time for one more question, I think, from the floor here.
I have a question for the translators, really, but I'm reading the book all the time now at the moment, and it's striking the novel as a translation project where everything you learn about the character you learn it very slowly, like on peeling layers, and there's an awful lot of hints and clues. For example, the first passage that you read about it with Tom Kendler's wondering what you would have seen in someone like him, who was of dubious extraction. And some translators prefer to read, a whole novel first and then start translating, and other people would like to pretend they're like the reader, that they're only planning how to translate. I'm wondering how the translators here operate, and if do they read something first, or do they change from novel to novel, or read about it?
I've never read the book before. My first draft is my reading. I try, with my first draft, I try not to do anything possible, less possible. And then I have all the book in mind. And my second draft is like sculpture. I try to sculpt it through. I just work on the language. And then I have several readings afterwards. That's how I do. Some do differently.
Aga?
Yeah, I mean, your first translation is not carved in stone. So if you come across something that you were not expecting, you can always go back. So this is why I don't like to read it all before translating. Sometimes I do, but most of the time I read some of it to make my decision. whether or not I want to translate something, but I want to have the reader's experience when I first work with all of the book. And then I can always go back. I can always go back and forth and work on it again.
Super. Chris?
Well, I don't normally read the novel that I have to translate before I start translating either. In this particular case, I haven't started on my translation yet, whereas these two ladies have finished their translation.
Almost.
But what I did for this particular occasion, I did a timeline, because as you suggested, the, shall we call it, the whereabouts of Tom Kettle and others, and they will reveal themselves bit by bit. You know, and you have to read quite a number of pages before you see, okay, that could actually be said and so on. So, for example, I had to work out when is the main action taking place. I thought it must be 1994. Then I had to see, is the Dart already running in 1994? Yes, it was, but not in the novel. Is there, you know, and you can work out things, but it takes a while. So I had to prove that, and I did a little, what would you call it, a sociogram of characters, you know, how they relate to each other. But I would normally never do that. I would go the same way as Laetitia. But funnily enough, not then 2, 3, 4, 5 drafts, but rather I go sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, chapter by chapter, and then of course revisiting if I notice that maybe I had misunderstood something which is revealed later on. Anyway.
Be careful of the spider. There's a mistake about the spider. First, in the room of Goethe-Institut, behind the bed, then it's up the cupboard or something like that. Be careful.
But spiders move.
If I can finish with you, Sebastian, and it's sort of in response to a question that we've got online. It's about your own relationship with your translators. I mean, have you gotten to know your translators over the years? Are they regularly in correspondence with you? Are they present in your life?
There's a sort of mythic. Whoops. There's a sort of mythic relationship. Patrick Kavanagh, whose little song I massacred earlier, said that they don't want writers talking about money because no one wants to give them any. So, but just to talk about money, I mean, foreign rights, after your initial advance, foreign rights are very uncertain things. Some books bring them, some books repel them. When they start to come in, you realize, as that person who doesn't have a wage, that because of this response of these individuals in publishing houses far afield and individual translators, you will be less worried about money for the coming period of time. That sounds almost trite, but actually to allay the worries, the private mind of a writer is in itself a magical medicine. So there's that, the absolute joy of those unlooked for emails that come in from your agent, headed Old God's Time French, Old God's Time Polish, Old God's Time German, and you just think, you just feel a little bit of a better grip on the cliff that is the Irish writer's financial. Then there is the fact that, as I said, I didn't read or write till I was 8, so that English, which I didn't even know it was called English, to me was a physical entity, and it remains so as much as I can preserve that feeling. So to be transmuted into languages that I could never access myself in any intelligent way is a profoundly ancient human enterprise. I read Latin and English here. I had enough trouble reading the English without all the English. In those days, you read everything from Beowulf to Christopher Schuart. I think he was the only living writer allowed in Trinity at the time for some reason. I read Latin. I read Latin very, very slow. I mean, the Aeneid took me a whole summer to crawl through, but I was determined to get the gist of the Latin because I thought Matthew Arnold had said, of all people, that ancient and modern literature would be the best education for writing. Similarly, I lived in Paris as a very young writer, 22, and couldn't speak French, even though I'd spent 14 years at school not learning it. And in Paris in those days, not a lot of people spoke English, nor truth. And they assumed, therefore, that this strange Irish person, I don't even know I was Irish, in his father's golfing jacket and his ragged shoes. Because in Paris, I realized they don't actually, first thing they do is they look at your shoes. Ever since I have tried to have decent shoes when I go to Paris, but my shoes weren't great. They also thought that because I didn't speak French, I mean, in a way, quite rightly, that I was obviously suffering from some form of idiocy. And they talked to me in that spirit. So I lived in Paris, totally in love with the place. I mean, physical response to the physical city was huge. And I was so poor, living off vegetables, go down to the market every Saturday and buy a bag of vegetables. That was it. If you had chocolate, it was chicory, and it'd be 2 squares. I mean, we were very impoverished, but I was rich because I was in a chambre de bonne in Paris. When I go back now to my lovely, lovely, heroic champion editor, Joël Loffeld at Gallimard, and I'm able to go in, I was talking about this to the lovely ambassador earlier, go in to the terrace and buy a cup of coffee. I mean, that would have ruined me and my girlfriend for a month if we'd done that. But to be able to go and do that and then go into see, this is what I feel you're doing by translating me, is you're allowing me a sort of secret citizenship, if I may say that in front of 2 ambassadors of other countries, which I mean, even when I go to America, another version of English, I feel a secret citizenship because of language. And I'm so grateful for that. I couldn't even express to you how grateful I am to be translated, because translation for me is an act of pure human magic that has its own intense mysteries that probably, like writing itself, shouldn't be teased out to the death.
Well, Sebastian, I hope we haven't teased this subject.
Not this occasion, Mike. No, this has been magical for me, I have to admit.
And I think it's been magical for all of us to listen both to Sebastian, Laetitia, Aga, and Chris, and the way they've spoken so generously and interestingly about the challenges and the innumerable pleasures of translating Sebastian Barry's work. I would like to thank EUNIC for providing us with the sort of support this evening, the Trinity Long Room Hub, the Trinity Centre for Literary and Cultural Translation, but above all, you who've come here in such numbers tonight, both physically here in the room and virtually online. So I just want to wish you a very happy evening. Bonnig Saltas Chujella Doniha agus Vekmij Shiv Egg Anam Show Sulugam Rish. Hopefully we'll see you again, if not next year, another time for to explore further the joys of translation. So thank you.